Thanks for the download. If you like what we're doing and want to help spread the word, then please take a few minutes to like this episode on Spotify, iTunes or YouTube. It'd also be great if you could subscribe to our YouTube channel or even take a few minutes to write a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you're listening on. If you want to support the podcast, the best way to do this is via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes, and I'm grateful for recent contributors helping keeping production costs to the minimum. My guest today is Phil Blood. Phil is a British historian and author specialising in military history, the Holocaust and Nazi occupation policies. He's best known for his in-depth research on the intersection of warfare and genocide, particularly in Eastern Europe during World War II. This podcast features a discussion regarding the historical perception of the German Army's professionalism in World War II. Phil, drawing on his experience and historical analysis, challenges the post-war romanticisation of the Wehrmacht, particularly in comparison to the British Army. The conversation explores the impact of propaganda, the realities of combat, and the differing levels of professionalism and training within both forces. We further examine the complexities of historical memory, the influence of key figures and their biases, and the problematic lingering admiration for aspects of the German military despite their connection to Nazi atrocities. Phil has written several books about the Second World War, including Hitler's Bandit Hunters, the SS and the Nazi occupation of Europe, Birds of Prey, Hitler's Luftwaffe, Ordinary Soldiers and the Holocaust in Poland, and his new book, War Comes to Aachen, The Nazis, Churchill and the Stalingrad of the West. He's also contributed to academic and military institutions and is recognised for his meticulous archival research and ability to uncover new perspectives on well-studied conflicts. His work continues to influence both scholarly and public understanding of Nazi occupation and military policy. As usual, we finish off with Desert Island Debts, the guest choice of book, film and luxury item if they're stranded in the middle of nowhere. Let's crack on. Thanks for coming to the podcast, Phil. I've been wanting to do this one for quite a while, so it's great to have you on.
Thank you very much, Colin. I've been looking forward to this.
In the 1980s, the German Army in World War II was looked upon by my generation of soldiers as the epitome of professionalism. Now, this image had been cultivated by many post-war historians who sort of contrasted the aggressive glamour of Blitzkrieg with the supposed plodding and defensive attitude of the British Army. And it wasn't really that I saw this change in round about the late 1980s, and I first read Sidney Jerry's classic book 18 Platoon about the fighting in Normandy in 1944. And I read that round about 1990, and it was published in 87. And in it he wrote, "Over the past 20 years, it has become the custom of some of our younger military writers to extol the professional ability of the Wehrmacht whilst decrying that of our own fighting arms, particularly our armour and infantry. This has perplexed me because it runs contrary to my experience. My 18 platoon were better soldiers than we fought. So was D Company and the whole of 4th Battalion, the Somerset Light Infantry. Admittedly, it was a good battalion, but I find it hard to believe that it was unique. This tendency among writers is understandable. They are too young to have taken part in the operations about which they write, and therefore they had to rely mainly on official records and personal interviews with those who were present." Now we need to and we can talk about this as we go on. Obviously, the German Army in 1944 was not the German Army in 1939-1940. But how did wartime propaganda and post-war historians influence perceptions of the Heer's professionalism?
I've talked about this subject before, and I always start with a comment, and it's quite simply, who won the war? Who was militarily victorious? And why did the British win? And I think what's actually happened over the years is that the British Army has become more and more professionalised. And what I mean by that is the days when it was a national service and a conscription Those days are so long ago, nobody remembers. Even the Michael Caines of this world, who were conscript soldiers in the 50s, are now fairly ancient and elderly. So the concept of the People's Army, if you like, has gone. And memories of that force have long been forgotten. And in the process of professionalisation, and I'm not wholly against this, I think a professional army has to identify aspects of how to be incredibly successful, incredibly tight, and to go for a winning streak. What I found odd is, as I've grown through the years and gone from a family of soldiers, I was raised amongst a family that had fought in both world wars and had relatives in Malaya and relatives in Korea. I found it very strange as time went on, their heroes were being trashed. And I think the most significant trashing was of Montgomery. That here was this general that had, Field Marshal, that had carried Britain through the Second World War from the midpoint to the end with some remarkable victories, especially the last one, Operation Varsity. You've got to imagine why would there be a necessity to trash Montgomery? And at the same time, as the trajectory of criticism of British performance, British soldiers, British officers was increasing, there was also an increase towards why the German Wehrmacht were better. When we say the Wehrmacht, at this stage I'm going to leave the Waffen-SS out and just stick with the three branches, which is the Kriegsmarine, the Luftwaffe, and das Heer. So the Heer, which we know as the army, was for a long time regarded as a complete and utter failure. And that for a while continued, even though you had people like Little Hart write books called The Other Side of the Hill. There was this general view that the German army had failed. So, for example, Her Majesty's Stationery Office in 1947 or thereabouts published a book, The Rise and Fall of the Luftwaffe. And although they showed how much technological advancement there was in the Luftwaffe, it expressed how completely disastrous the whole process was as a fighting force, not just from the fighter arm and the bombing arm and the reconnaissance, but the use of experimental weapons, the fact that they couldn't train enough people, the shortfalls in oil supplies and shortages of the alloys to build the aircraft. It just showed that it was never going to be, once war had started, it was never going to be the force that it was expected to be. And of course, the thing people forget about the Luftwaffe was it was intended to be the Nazis' sole military force. Eventually, the army would disappear. The SS would guard the inner state, and the Luftwaffe, which would be a combination of air warfare, air landing, paratroopers, that would be how Germany would defend itself. If you look at operations like Crete, they send in waves of paratroopers. Once they've captured the airfields, in come the air landing units, and then later they send in supplies of tanks and the rest of it. That's how the Luftwaffe was expected to become by 1950. The fact that Hitler went to war very early just gives you an idea of how incomplete the force was. Now, you come back to Luftwaffe as a Nazi organization, and you're dealing with a force that was 5 million strong. Well, the British Army was 5 million strong in the Second World War. So that gives you an idea of equivalence. Here's just one force within the Nazi military establishment with as many men as the entire British Army throughout the Second World War. And yet, why is that the case? Well, they went into field divisions, they went into experimental troops, they had ski troops, they had police troops. What was actually happening is you have the German army representing the state, pretty much as it had always been, the Prussian army being famous for an army that held the state to ransom. The German army continued with that process with all of its supporting functions. The Kriegsmarine was always on the edge. The Luftwaffe came along because Goering had been trained in the German army ways, and he was trying to replicate the German army, but with the idea of the levée en masse and French revolutionary arms coming in, and he saw the technology of the Luftwaffe as a means to carrying the German army, or what would be the new German force, the Luftwaffe army, into the future. And that's exciting stuff. But in the reality of everyday fighting, winning the Second World War, the Luftwaffe very rapidly became unfit for purpose. And you can see that happening after Stalingrad. I mean, everyone says, well, the Luftwaffe was destroyed in Stalingrad. Well, maybe the resupply scenario was, but actually it was just being ground down on so many fronts. It just could not cover the amount of commitments it was required to do. Whereas on the ground level, the German army could cover whole areas of Russia in the east, Yugoslavia, the Balkans, and then later in Normandy and the desert. That wasn't so hard because the German army was very effective and very efficient in putting guns to the front. And that became a thing later on. The problem was, as you put more and more guns to the front and less in support and supply and making things work, the German army was prone to breaking down, which is what happens in 1944 when the German army gets trashed at Bagration on the Eastern Front, gets trashed in Italy in the Battle of Cassino's and that area. And then, of course, Normandy, when Montgomery produces this massive victory over the German armed forces in the West, which pretty much shatters everything and forces them to run away as quickly as possible. So you've got all of these things working against the Germans, but at the same time, people are saying, well, the Germans have got Tiger tanks and the Germans have got Panther tanks. Well, actually, they're a hindrance to effectiveness in the field. One of my arguments is if the German army had stayed with Mark IV tanks, they'd probably have won the Battle of the Bulge. Relied on these heavy, useless tanks, which, okay, they're high performance, they could work really fast, it had a kick, but you didn't need that for a breakout. But they forgot those principles. If you went back to 1940, when they broke through in France at Sedan, it was Mark IIIs and light Mark IIs that gave Rommel the power to break through, and Guderian and these people, to smash through the very cumbersome, very slow Allied forces.
The Mark IV, I think, saw service throughout the majority of the war. If they'd treated the Mark IV like Shermans and ignored the development of the Panther, Tigers, which are very few in the battle space, as you've alluded to, would that have made much of a difference in the end?
I think so. And it comes down to just how you manage the articulation of the Panther and the complication of the Tiger. They had to be loved to stay in combat. And when I mean loved, I mean huge man-hours to dismantle that articulated wheel arrangement and sort out the chassis and put the tracks through. Yeah, everybody says these are the greatest tanks that ever lived, but they're the most remarkably difficult to maintain. And of course, many of them got left behind on the Western Front. For an army that's having to drag these heavy, great vehicles around rather than being mobile, it's that shift that occurs in the middle of 1941 that comes out in 43, 44 with this new army or this new Wehrmacht, which, okay, it's trying to hold ground, it's trying to stabilize fronts, it's trying to stay in the war. Hitler's promising them new weapons like rockets and God knows what else were intended to turn up. But the German armed forces were actually becoming more and more depleted. The professional soldiers who went in 1940, they're getting fewer and fewer by 44 because they've been committed to hard war for almost now 4 years. Well, the British Army, okay, a few divisions like the 7th, the 51st Highland and others have been fighting hard in the desert, and there's been some troops who have obviously been sent to Cyprus, Crete, and there's been fighting in Palestine. But most of the divisions that are being raised and re-raised in UK, they're not being trashed. When those soldiers land in 1944, they're highly professional. I mean, okay, some people say, they got to the point where they were overtrained. I don't believe you can be overtrained. And I think when the British Army hit Normandy, it was a shock for the Germans. And when I say the British Army, I mean the Commonwealth of Armies. So you got the Canadians and the Poles, anybody else who was involved under 21st Army Group. When they hit Normandy, that was a shock. The Germans expected the British to be pretty much like they had been in 1940. And now they were facing soldiers who, would take them on face to face and hit them hard. You can find stories like Churchill pandering to the Fox legend with Rommel for his own political purposes. And you can find Little Hart in The End of the War interviewing all the generals to produce a book, The Other Side of the Hill, to give the impression that the Germans were advantageous and were greater soldiers. But that doesn't really happen till a long time after the war. And we forget in all of this period, between 1944 and right the way through to 1952, the British are committed to war crimes trials, which is often forgotten because the Americans take the story and they're seen to be the people who are running Nuremberg. Actually, Britain is running a large number of war crimes trials, including the famous one against Manstein. And that continues in Germany. And Britain has its own execution process of getting rid of war criminals. Albert Pierrepoint is brought in by the British Armed Forces in Germany, and he's shipped from Manchester to Bielefeld every week. He's flown in, he commits however many executions, and then he's flown back. And it's quite interesting, the bills that he's paid for and looked after if you look at his private files. And the British Army is very committed to ensuring that military justice is being seen to be done, especially when you've had SOE operatives, British commandos, and of course all the Canadian and British soldiers who were murdered in Normandy and other places. So there is a long period after the war when the German army is not the most favoured force. This is something that starts to emerge in the 50s as the emphasis on war crimes trials drops away and new authors come into the game and start telling stories which have a different complexion on events.
And didn't people like Little Hart, when he was interviewing German generals as the war was basically come to an end, I've read that he basically sort of produced his own legend by, when he's doing his interviews, saying, "Oh, did you ever study my papers, my pre-war papers?" And then that was brought into his book, that the German general studied Little Hart, and then that in itself contributed in some way to that myth of the German army.
It's a two-way story, because while Little Hart is making sure that they're bigging him up, later they big up Little Hart in their own way. It's like a two-way story of these people constantly giving favoritism to each other. What I never understood about Little Hart is how he could be so removed from the reality of the war, given that he was close to Chester Wilmot, who was one of the war correspondents under Montgomery and actually saw the fighting pretty much, and Montgomery, who was this winning general. Now, I do know that Montgomery saw the post-mortem reports for the British soldiers murdered in Normandy, British and Canadian soldiers that were murdered in Normandy by the SS. So there's every reason to believe that Montgomery was also not greatly favourable to the Germans, but I think he mellowed. I think once the war ended and time moved on and became NATO commander, his attitude towards things mellowed. Whereas if you look at Bradley, even in 1951, Bradley's overstating the power of the Wehrmacht in his memoirs, which is not something that Montgomery ever did. Montgomery spends all of his time trashing the Germans and making sure they're seen to be trashed in his memoirs, whereas Bradley, at one point I remember reading Bradley's memoirs for my Arkham book, and he's got something like 500 Tiger tanks. Well, there was only 1,500 Tiger tanks produced in the whole war. So it's different agendas to different stories.
I mean, it's interesting you say that. You got these people polishing their own myths, because something that I heard recently was that Patton's wife edited his diaries that ended up in the archives, and she edited them in such a way that they made him look even better, and it's only recently that's come to light. But I also wonder how much the Germans' own propaganda, the German army, again, please correct me if I'm wrong here, but predominantly horse-drawn even at the start of the war, at the height of Blitzkrieg.
Yes.
But their propaganda, the recruitment posters, everything, when you compare that to what the British turned out, I think sometimes their own myth-making influenced opinion.
To a certain extent. It's quite interesting. In 1994, I was lucky enough to be with a whole load of Normandy veterans. We were walking through the area where the Falaise pocket had taken place, where there was that great trashing of the German armies there. And as I'm walking with these veterans, they kept saying, the smell's coming back. And I'm saying, well, what smell? And they said, horses' harnesses and peroxide soap, which was the smell that they were always recurringly remembered of the Germans. This horrible stinky soap, which, funny enough, my neighbour used to talk about quite often, the stinky soap. And he fought in the German Army in the East. He was a German infantryman, and he, for a short period, after he had been wounded in the stomach after several assaults on Russian lines, he was returned to Cologne and he was put into a flak unit. And they had horses, and he had to go back to learning how to deal with horses. He said it was the one time when in his life when he'd been on a farm with his father, he'd actually learned to use the traces. And it went back to working with the traces to move the guns. Yeah, I mean, it's a huge problem. If you've got at one end, you've got panzer divisions with Tiger tanks that need God knows how many heavy FAMO-type vehicles to support them, plus maintenance cranes, plus God knows what else, and maintenance crews of huge numbers just to change one set of wheels. And here you are, the average infantryman, the lowly cannon fodder, moving guns with horses and having to work that route. I mean, there's such a gap between what people imagine the German army to be and what the German army actually was, that it's very easy to make the wrong assumptions. And I understand why social media, it's very fascinating for young people to think, they look at these pictures, many of which are Nazi propaganda films of Stuka dive bombers and Tiger tanks doing stuff and what have you. But the average Joe, the average Fritz, he's fighting a much harder war. And of course, as professional soldiers, you know this as a soldier yourself, hard war grinds a person down. And German soldiers are literally getting worn down. So by the time you get to 44, 45, they're pretty much exhausted. They're a bit like Ukrainian soldiers are now in the fight against Russia. They haven't got enough men. They're fighting mass, which is what the Russians, the British and the Americans represented in 1944, and they just haven't got the energy to fight back. I mean, we do know about these battles in the East and the West, the Battle of the Bulge, but I call that the defender's dilemma. At some point, you've got to attack just to alleviate, and I think this is what's happened in Ukraine, in Kursk. You need to take the pressure off the front, even just to give the civilians some breathing space in their minds that there is a chance of survival. And that's what happens in the Ardennes. They commit to this military operation, and of course they do further military operations in the East. And that's really not going anywhere, but alleviating the pressure on the mindset. It's only temporary. And of course, afterwards, the German army got so trashed during the Battle of the Bulge, it rapidly dissolved, and they were forced to make all sorts of rapid changes. I mean, we're what, in March? The Bulge would have been over in January, and already the British Armed Forces, as they're pushing forward from Varsity, going towards Hamburg and Rostock, you know, they're saying to themselves, it is over, we want to survive this, which is, of course, an added pressure on the British Army. But coming back to what you were saying with the Jerry book and how the British soldiers fought, my view is, and I go back to that point, who won the war? I actually think you have a remarkably professional British Army at the end of the Second World War, second to none. And that's not because I've got all these relatives who fought in the 7th Armoured Division and the Chindits and Princess Louises and the blah, blah, blah. It's a simple fact that you only have to look at something like the records of the Queen's Regiment, who lands at Normandy. They confront some serious Waffen-SS counterattacks. They meet all forms of huge heavy armour. And those soldiers carry on fighting right the way through. They show excessive professionalism. I mean, the thing I notice most about the Queen's Regiment as an infantry regiment is just how many patrols they conduct in a day. You're thinking, here's a regiment what's that, about 1,000 men?
Yeah.
Well, they must have at least have had 100 men on patrol at some point each day.
Wasn't officer casualties in Normandy exceeding that on the Western Front as well, which indicates the level of fighting that British troops were taking part in?
Yeah, and of course, what you get happening in Normandy with the losses, because some of the soldiers were actually taking amazing risks, which is what happens with, I suppose, with new soldiers when they're put into their first combats, the first blooding. There is first blooding, and of course they suffer huge losses, and divisions are forced to be crushed, dismantled, cooks being moved to front lines, draining out the training schools. I mean, that's huge pressure on the reserves. But Churchill's war, when you think about it, is more committed to bombing and the Royal Air Force and maintaining a war footing, which isn't the same as the Germans. The Germans have gone all out, total war, large military forces on the ground. Britain hasn't done that. It's not going to take the same losses that it suffered in the First World War. It will fight a war to preserve much of the masculine line.
And by 44, we were starting to suffer infantry shortages, weren't we? So we couldn't just throw away people, could we?
No, but the actual investment of war, if you look at it in terms of the logic of Churchill's war, it's the Royal Air Force which is getting all the money, it's getting all the investment, it's getting all the support, it's getting all the right aircraft. The aircraft industry demands a large turnover, huge manpower sources of intelligent men, capable people who need to be in those support areas. And you look, for every bomber that's going off, there must be 100, 150 men and women who need to support that aircraft going into the air, not just the 7 crewmen, but all the bombers, the gunners, and everybody else, armourers, who support that aircraft into combat. And you've got to imagine 1,000 bomber raid. If all of those aircraft are lost, Britain is bankrupt. And Britain doesn't have an alternative. So he has to wage a different kind of war. It's not the kind of war that I agree with, and as you know, I've been opposed to certain things about that war. But once you commit to that, you're going to have problems with troops on the ground because you're no longer aimed towards a large army. Okay, there's 5 million men in the British Army, but there's only 1 in 25 who's at the front line. And it's a very different army from anything like the First World War army. It's a highly professional army with a conscript force. So it's maintaining a lot of its traditional military professions and professionalism, while at the same time trying to put all these men into the force. I think it's a remarkable achievement what the British Army did in the Second World War, but it was never going to get the investment like the Royal Air Force. And I think we forget that.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, that comment you made about 1 in 25 being in the front line. In some respects, the German army was the opposite because they were quite an infantry-heavy organisation.
Right.
And those guys weren't citizen soldiers. By 44, 45, you probably had 18, 19-year-olds that were entirely shaped and indoctrinated by Nazi philosophy. So it's interesting to see those two dynamics fighting each other, I think.
Yes, and I think that's one of the reasons why the German army field tactics are quite standard. It's always to outflank, so they're constantly trying to encircle and outflank the British. They will use mass in a charge, and the British will put up their guns, the Lee Enfields, and will take down Germans in large numbers, which is why you get fields full of dead Germans in certain places like Normandy. And you've got to wonder why the Germans don't always change their tactics. And I have difficulty explaining that to people, but it strikes me they don't have the time, they don't have the assurance, but most importantly, when you're a fanatical racist army, you don't think your enemy's that good anyway. So why do you need to change your tactics? Because, you know, the British are useless. Once we got the British, it's all done, we'll kill them. That works against them. And if you look at the interrogations of German soldiers by the British during that period, you can see that initially there's a high morale, And then within a week of heavy fighting with the British, that morale is getting shattered. And the first waves that hit the beaches, up until the first 6 days, 7 days, the Germans are saying they've never been treated like that. They've never experienced that wave of gunfire and bombing and everything else that came at them. Even the Russians couldn't produce that level of firepower. And it literally in places just wiped them away.
You're talking about why they kept doing the same tactics. I can't remember the exact figures, but German basic training had gone, say, from 18 weeks to down to about 9 weeks. But British Army infantry training remained the same length throughout the war. So we were still giving our guys quality training, but the German meat grinder meant they had to rush more and more people through.
And again, this is going back to one of your questions where you're saying, what was the view of the British training? My view of British training is it was pretty solid. You can see that when you're talking to the veterans. And I'm not just talking about my own family. I was lucky enough to get to know a man called Sir Paul Bryan. And Paul Bryan had been one of Churchill's whips after the end of the Second World War in the 50s. And he came up with a series of discussions with me one day when I asked him what was service like in the war, because he produced about a book called Wool of War and Westminster, and he had joined the Royal West Kent Regiment and served as an intelligence officer in 1940. And I was literally talking to him about it. Hadn't seen anything more of the book. And he suddenly started to talk about the battle schools where he had worked with Dennis Foreman. And Sir Paul had got to a battle school in 1944, having been taken out of the line after a pretty tragic incident when his driver was hit by a sniper, and it kind of shocked him out. And they took him out the line and put him to a battle school. And his adjutant was a chap called Dennis Foreman, who'd lost a leg in Italy earlier in the campaign. So you've got a battle-hardened lieutenant colonel who'd been in the front since 1940 and had fought in the desert. And you've got this adjutant who'd had a similar experience from a Scottish regiment. They put them two together and they put them in a battle school, I think in Warminster or somewhere. I might be wrong, I can't remember. And the way they were training young soldiers and young officers in preparation for war struck me as way ahead of anything the Germans were doing, simply because the Germans couldn't have the resources. I know the Germans did sandpit exercises. I know they took young soldiers out to work with Panzerfaust and all of that stuff. But it strikes me that what Paul Bryan and Dennis Foreman were doing was much more of not just how to fight the enemy, but how to survive and fight the enemy, and how to exist in the conditions in the battlefield, and how to get the best out of your troops. And that struck me as remarkable. And there was, the names that were flying around back in that time included Lionel Wigram, who Montgomery wasn't very keen on, apparently, but created these battle school ideas and learning to take the experience of war and transmit it back through the military structure. So forces coming forward, new battalions, new companies, the troops knew what they were confronting and how to deal with it within their capabilities. And I think that gives such a huge boost to the British Army when it comes back to Europe in 1944, and it doesn't go away. I mean, it just gets better. Yeah, I know people go on about what happened at the Battle of Arnhem and all of this stuff, but that's just one operation in however many there were. And the learning curve from Arnhem is varsity. So they go from not winning in Arnhem to complete massive operational supremacy in varsity. And the thing about varsity is it's a lesson to the Russians. You might take a year to learn how the Germans are changing their warfare. We can do it in less than a month if we need to.
I think it's interesting, some of the points you've picked up on there, because I just want to throw some stuff in from Sidney Jerry's book again. And he touched on a few things you said there. Now, firstly, he said, I now have little doubt that for the first 2 months in Normandy, we lacked two things: comprehensive and imaginary training and personal experience of battle. We are seriously handicapped by a casual attitude. Too many junior officers did not think for themselves and persistently relied on narrow teaching of the battle schools, whose dogma had assumed a proportion of Holy Writ. Then went on and said something you alluded to earlier. The British infantry platoons and companies were overtrained and bold stuff with basic infantry tactics, which as far as they went were good. But at the bottom of this paragraph he says, the battlefield became our teacher, and inevitably it exacted a grim price in blood and time. I think that perhaps does tie in a loose way with what you've just said there, because using your Arnhem analogy, that was a learning experience that they applied to varsity. Jerry's saying there they had a good basic grounding, but some of the officers lacked imagination. But ultimately, your most grim teacher is the battle space.
The thing that Chris Bellamy, my former number 2 supervisor when I was at the Royal Military Academy, his view is strategic plans, tactical ideas, operational methods all go out of the window as soon as day one of the war starts. Soon as the fighting starts, everything that you've learned, everything that's gone on, all of that disappears and you create a new narrative. Now,
we'll see that in Ukraine.
I can go with that. Yeah, I mean, I can go with that. I can understand that and I can appreciate that. And Chris is right. And Chris was in the Royal Artillery. Chris worked with Richard Holmes, my old boss. Chris was way into military operations. He was a war correspondent in Bosnia. He saw how bad things can get. He understood war far more than I did. My whole process has really been focused mostly on occupation. I saw the Russian army in occupation. I've never really spent much time actually in a war zone being bombed. But I can go by what I read from the Queen's Regiment, and I'm looking at their war diaries on a daily basis from the 6th of June right the way through till December 1944. And there's procedures, there are actions. They produce patrol maps, skizzies, where they write down where they've been and what they saw and all the detail. Then there's the action. Then they know they're coming to a wet point with a canal. They deal with that problem and they move forward. And it struck me that, okay, they threw everything out they learned when they were in England, but they certainly learned very quickly how to deal with the battle conditions of Western Europe in a pretty soggy and cold, wet period of the year. And they fought, as far as I can see, a very clever way of fighting. The 7th Armoured Division gets constantly berated for what happened when Michael Wittmann, the SS commander, rolled into their vanguard and smashed up 25 vehicles, 3 tanks, 2 of which were not particularly impressive, and then he waved at them and disappeared. That's a story that's often told. It's in all the books. It's even in recent books that have been written about the Normandy situation. If you look at the 7th Armoured Division, when that occurred, when their own people were writing the reports on what actually happened, that was like, okay, we had a problem in the morning. Now where are we? Well, we've advanced. We've made up the loss of vehicles. Oh, and yeah, the Germans are running away. So who won that? Wittmann in his 1 tank? Or did he actually lose all 3 of his tanks and we advanced? Well, they advanced. The problem is incidences and cases and moments and stories get increased, raised, become worsened. But you have to look at the overall trajectory of the way the fighting was going. And okay, the British had setbacks. The Americans had setbacks. The Russians had setbacks. The Germans had more setbacks than anybody and eventually lost the war. So you have to decide how much is just a setback and how much is a serious hit. And I defy anybody to tell me that the British Army took a serious hit apart from Arnhem, where to a certain extent they shot themselves in the foot.
It's interesting you go about Wittmann because I don't want to harp on about it because he gets enough publicity. But that's propaganda at its best from the German side that was swallowed over here as well. But I was Battery Sergeant Major of K Battery, and K Battery had the battle honour of Hondegem from a battle on the retreat to Dunkirk in 1940. And there's an MC one, MMs and all the rest of it. And quite rightly, the battle's well written up in our history room, and the history of the battery is held very proudly. But I read the German war diary of the attacking panzer unit. And going back to your Wittmann piece, that German panzer unit wrote, we came up to the village, I'll paraphrase now, we came up to the village of Hondegem, There was a brave detachment of English soldiers who held us up for a couple of hours before we further advanced. And that was it. I was expecting some sort of hagiography of what K Battery did, but I think just the way Wittmann's portrayed, he was portrayed for a reason, like the Battle of Hondingham was portrayed for a reason.
You see, the interesting thing about what actually happens with that story, and I'll just go through it briefly. I know you don't really want to do too much, but here's a book, and I'm going to put it up to the screen to you. It's Paul Hauser's Waffen-SS in Einsatz. Now, that was the first book written after the war by an SS man trying to recover SS memory of the war. That whole incident, he gave that incident at Villers-Bocage on 12-13 June 1944, he attributed to a Wehrmacht division. Wittmann wasn't there. It's only when you get to 1960, when Kurt Meyer, famous for having committed war crimes against the Canadians and had been in Canadian prison for so long, comes out of the prison and writes his memoirs called Grenadier. And he writes about Wittmann's incident. And that incident gets bigger and bigger and bigger because as Meyer writes one book, his operations officer, a man called Hubert Meyer, not the same family, wrote the full story of the 12th SS Panther Division and included a huge segment on Wittmann. Come 1966, 67 or thereabouts, Tamiya, the Japanese model kit builder, produces a tank with the Wittmann colour scheme. And then by the time you get into the 70s and 80s, you've got Hastings and Anthony Beaver and these people making this story even larger and reducing the 7th Armour Division. And it's always struck me as odd that the 7th Armour Division is, even by somebody like Anthony Beaver, who served in the Hussars, and I think the Hussars was a regiment in the 7th Armour Division. I could be wrong, I don't know. But he could actually write about this great SS man over the British achievement. And the British achievement is, you've got British crews in a Comet tank and they weren't running away. They stood up to him and they took him on. The troops that were in those unarmed vehicles still stood by and fought, and they carried on fighting until after the incident and carried the vanguard of the division forward. So it's easy to say, oh, I'm roaming around in a Tiger tank. Of course you can be invincible in a Tiger tank when everything you're firing against has got minor pea shooters and very skin armour. But did the British back down? No, they didn't. They got up and fought. And not only that, they kept at it. And that's the thing that the Germans couldn't cope with, because they're giving the British all this heavy power, 88mm guns, Tiger tanks, you name it. And the British saying, right, well, I have some 5.5-inch medium artillery and some 25-pounders, and here's some Lancasters. And actually, we're going to throw the whole lot at you and the kitchen sink. And it's such a shock. But then historians come along and they write this story, and a British division gets trashed after, 4 years of fighting, constant fighting in the desert, which has brought victory and defeats, taken on Rommel, eventually defeated him, and they're at the end. The 7th Armour Division is there at the end. Where's the 12th SS?
Destroyed.
Trashed and dead.
Yeah.
Well, that's what they should be. I mean, everybody places them as great soldiers. I'm only interested in the soldiers, really, who win. What's the point of... do I want to be a nation that's run by soldiers that lose?
Do you think... I don't know, it's weird, because we've partly answered the question I asked originally. And I think, I don't know, I'm coming down to the fact that it's a mix of people writing memoirs where they want to make themselves look better, propaganda, maybe ignorance about how good the British Army was. And the Brits always love an underdog. I don't know if there's some sort of perverse sympathy for an underdog who put up a fight.
Well, Napoleon, I'm a fan of Napoleon because I like some of the battles, and I was very interested in Napoleonic warfare as a young person. And it's understandable the Imperial Guard gets all the interest because it's an elite unit. A similar thing happens with the Confederates, the American Civil War. And to a certain extent, the Scots and Bloody Prince Charlie and the Americans with the Alamo. The losers get this, whatever, something or other. But I guess when you've been taught in strategic studies and your aim is to learn how to win, it's very difficult to pander to a whole load of losers, other than to say, well, is there anything from that is there anything that you can learn from them that will improve what you're doing? Well, okay, there were aspects of the German performance it was outstanding. There's no doubt about that. When the Luftwaffe first went into war, it was just shooting down everything that got in the way. As soon as it was put to a stretch, once it went to the Battle of Britain and it went to stretch, it couldn't cope. It just could not cope, and it got smashed. But then when the Royal Air Force were boasting that they'd smashed the Luftwaffe, starts to do rhubarb raids in 1941, they got trashed, which is why Douglas Bader and Stanford Tuck and all these people landed behind enemy lines. Now, the question is, which I find fascinating, you've been shot down by Adolf Galland and you've been put in a prison camp and you've gone through that for 4 years. You come out and then you write forwards to people like Galland's book or Heinz Rudol's book. And you've got to wonder what goes through their minds. You know, Rudel is an unreconstructed Nazi who's living in Argentina saying, we want the Führer back and I'm happy to mix with people like Mengele and other evildoers. And there's Douglas Bader writing forward. And this is where we come back to this story of why, for some reason, the British, certain class of British society wants to do truck with, for me, war criminals, for an armed force which sole purpose was not only to destroy Jewry in the whole of Europe, the whole of the, a force that was actually built to work towards Hitler's grand plan to destroy all the Jews of Europe. The German army is defending Auschwitz and the camps.
Do you not think, though, that...
And that cannot be forgotten.
Absolutely. But do you not think that attitude that you just described there to the Luftwaffe is the same attitude applied to the Afrika Korps, in that Knights of the Sky and in the desert warfare, it was gentleman's warfare with hardly any civilian involvement, and which helps feed into, again, that perception that it wasn't the ethnic cleansing, the massacres on the Eastern Front, that type of thing. Do you think people built these narratives and that's how they could reconcile by writing these forwards and things like that, pushing away the politics and just looking at it as a gentleman's war?
It's possible. And I mean, I got caught up in that. In 1970, we got taken on one of those package tours to Spain. I don't know if you remember that stuff, but you had to go on a package tour because you couldn't take a lot of currency out of the country and all of those rules. So we ended up going to this place in New York or somewhere. And I sat at a table with this fascinating language and I didn't understand a word of it. And the men talking to me said, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm English." And they said they were German. And eventually I discovered that they're all members of the Afrika Korps. And I'm telling them that my Uncle Jim fought in the Desert Rat. So I had a wonderful time. My parents allowed me to have beer. So I'm sat with a whole load of Afrika Korps drinking beer. And they seem like good chaps. 6 years later, I stood next to a whole load of Afrika Korps at Montgomery's funeral. Yes, I went to the funeral in Windsor. And yes, I stood there as his funeral cortege went past. And there were men from the Afrika Korps who stood to attention when Montgomery went past. My Uncle Jim thought the Afrika Korps were the best soldiers the world had ever seen. Couldn't say anything wrong about them. Yeah, they were hard fighters. Yeah, they damaged his head in Tobruk in 1941. But basically, they were the best German soldiers you could ever meet. Uncle Stan met them at Mercer Matrone. He said, well, they weren't very good in 1940 and they weren't very good in 1942, 43. So he had a different view. Okay. Decades later, when I'm doing my research, I come across evidence where the Afrika Korps has been involved in the murder and arrest of and deportation of Jews in the Mediterranean. Then you suddenly see that other complexion. Rommel, for most of his time before he went to the desert, was Hitler's personal liaison officer. And you've got to wonder, as his senior guardsman, Praetorian Guard, how much he knew what was going on. And we know that the killing started in 1939 in Poland, that Leni Riefenstahl was there to witness one and filmed it. We know there was massive killings and that Rommel went with Hitler into Poland while all of that was going on. So your impression of things change. I put a paper up some time ago on German Army. This isn't the Waffen-SS. German Army cruelties and atrocities to British soldiers in the Second World War, and it's alarming. And Colonel Scotland, who was investigating German crimes on behalf of British military intelligence, he represented a case in Germany in, I think, 1950, known as the Benghazi case, when members of the Hermann Goering Panzer Division went into British field hospitals that they captured and shot the British soldiers. And of course, we know what happened in 1940 at Vermouth and Le Paradis. We know about the murders in Normandy, and subsequently, we know the Jedburgh teams that were destroyed by the SS. We know the SOE girls who were put into the furnaces while still compos mentis, so they knew they were being burnt. Well, they were burnt alive. With all of that, and with meeting people who had suffered at their hands, like I met M.R.D. Foote, who was SOE intelligence officer, captured in 1944, I think, near Brittany, very, very seriously brutalized by German torturers. I find it incredibly difficult to say anything positive about the German armed forces in the Second World War. I mean, we've got to have them in living history. I understand that. I don't mean the SS. I mean German soldiers. If you're going to do living history, you have people who have to understand how the Germans perform. You have to have German tanks in museums. I understand all of that. And in the films, somebody's going to be a German hero, blah, blah, blah. But to actually write about these guys as some kind of super warriors and then to diminish the capability of the British as a consequence, I think is unforgivable.
So how do you think then the myth of the Heer as an apolitical professional force was so appealing in the UK and the US then?
Well, of course, there's British generals, former generals like Michael Reynolds, who've written about the SS, but also had opinions about the German army. There's a former British paratrooper, Kershaw, who's written about Arnhem. He wrote a particularly good book on Arnhem, and he's written about the German army in Dunkirk.
Is that Never Snows in September, the Arnhem book, I think? Is that?
That's the Arnhem book.
The German viewpoint, isn't it?
Yeah, the German viewpoint of Arnhem. There's others, and I can understand that there was an attraction, especially for somebody who's in a paratroop regiment, to look for comparisons on that kind of level of soldiery. With Mike Reynolds, I just found him very odd. I met him in 1998. I was then the Fellow of Military History at the Royal United Services Institute, and I was invited by him and Richard Holmes to go and talk to them about the two books. He's a very nice character, a very nice man. He offered me his books, he signed them, did all the business, and we had lunch. But his attitude towards the Germans was quite odd. When you kind of dug down and you're talking to somebody who's written about somebody like Joachim Peiper, who was the adjutant to Himmler and also the senior commander in the Battle of the Bulge and other things, other battles. Here was a man who'd been on inspection tours of concentration camps. And Mike Reynolds just literally would not believe it. When I spoke to him and I said, all of these guys that you're putting forward as great soldiers, they all got automatic promotions immediately after the Rome Putsch in 1934. And I said, doesn't that make you wonder what their real political intent was? He just couldn't see it. I don't understand a lot of the logic of why you'd want to delve into the SS. I can understand the doesn't snow in September, October, wherever, why that was interesting, because it wasn't so much focusing on particular German individuals as the battle from the German perspective. And I think that's important. And as a NATO officer, it's good to be able to have had a knowledge of how the German side was. Just for historical purposes, I think it's important. Where I do get a problem is with Simon Akram's book, where you have, he's talking about Iraq, the book Changing the Guard. And he's, one of the earliest chapters, he's got a British tank commander running around in a chieftain tank. And under his overalls, he's got a Waffen-SS uniform on because he's reenacting Michael Wittmann. And I think that suddenly tells me we have an issue and a problem and there's something else going on. I don't think there's many people who want to put themselves in that position without having some kind of deeper interest beyond soldiering. The fact that the officers didn't do anything, I found it very strange. That whole part of the book, I thought, why is nobody commenting about this in the reviews? It's almost like, well, the British Army's got this fascination with the Germans. It's an unpleasant fascination, and therefore we have to just accept it. It's very interesting. In 1996, Richard Holmes attended the Edinburgh University Conference on the experience of the soldier in the Second World War. And he was interested that the British contingent had a completely different vision of the German army in the Second World War from the German historians themselves. It was almost like two different logics. And one of the first things he said to me, because I met him soon afterwards, if you're going to do a PhD on this subject, I need somebody to explain to me why is there such a vast difference between our view, the British, the Western view, and the Germans themselves. And I think it's simply because the whole political side of the Wehrmacht's operations, including now with the Waffen-SS, has never been taken to the full political extent. So even when they introduced the political officers in 1943-44, and you also had the bomb plot, they were always treated separately. Yeah. So the political people did political stuff, and the academics, they did the bomb plot. But the military historians avoided that because it was too, it's like Maxey used to say in his books, this book is only military history, it's nothing to do with political. Well, how do you separate that? Yeah. The separation of the political, what? So you only mention up to the point where they do the Nazi salute, and then you pick it up after they've done the Nazi salute, or do you include the Nazi salute? Or do you get into this huge fight that Guy Hamilton had with Adolf Galland, which is Galland said he never gave the Nazi salute. Guy Hamilton said that's impossible. And then Phil Blood comes along 40 years later, constantly looking for photographs where Adolf Galland is constantly giving the Nazi salute because it's important.
Yeah, and also you can't separate the German army from the politics. But didn't all German soldiers, airmen, sailors have to swear a personal oath to Adolf Hitler, or was that just the Waffen-SS?
They did indeed. They did indeed.
Even that would shoot down that whole argument, wouldn't it?
Well, of course. But the problem is they were easily believed. And I take something that's really might be a shock. World at War did a lot to recuperate the reputation of the Wehrmacht, even though it wasn't intended. Because what happened in that series was people like Adolf Galland and Manteuffel, the German general who led the operations in the Ardennes, they were given the kudos of being German generals of a high reputation. They weren't like the SS, they weren't in the genocide chapter, which was their war criminals. Here you've got, and even Speer was included, like he was a decent Nazi. And I've even heard people say, Speer was a decent Nazi. And I said, you should put that to the millions of slave labourers he employed. The fact of the matter is, there was this opinion which has always been divorced from the reality. And it's like recently somebody reviewed my book about birds of prey. And they're trying to say that, I didn't look at certain things and I didn't talk about certain things. They didn't focus on the fact that the book was about the Holocaust and the Luftwaffe's behaviour in the Holocaust. What unstripping that is about. Because up until now, the Luftwaffe was regarded as something that was just up in the clouds, flying around in aeroplanes, and couldn't possibly do anything unpleasant. The fact that Adolf Galland, who was the chief of fighters, the general of fighters, was signing off Jews working on aircraft production in the camps, the fact that he was agreeing with Traubloft, another one of the fighter pilots, to produce a comic handbook in which symbols of anti-Semitism were written through it, were completely forgotten and ignored. All that the Luftwaffe central area where Adolf Galland's headquarters were was also part of what called Luftgau District 1, Luftgau 1, which was also monitoring Jew-killing operations in the forests of Poland. What military force are we dealing with here? The one that's flying around in Messerschmitt 109s, or this thing that's contributing to the wholesale destruction of Jews of Europe? And that's the problem people have. They still have that problem. Even young people who are coming in writing books about, I don't know, Focke-Wulf 200 aircraft flying around on the Atlantic convoys. The link is, why is that aircraft doing that thing for this empire? And they forget that the whole of this empire is up for the reconstruction of Europe, the destruction of European Jewry, and the creation of a slave state which is going to live off Slavs. And eventually, Auschwitz, once all the Jews are dead, the Slavs are going to be the next lot, because there will be no room for them in the empire. You couldn't take 250 million Slavs into the Nazi empire and keep them. That would have been impossible. So you don't just look at the project to destroy anti-Semitism, to destroy the Jews. You don't just look at the destruction of the disabled and the handicapped, the T4 cases. You also have to look at all the others, the Sinti Romana. They've gone into other countries and killed those populations. They've killed the population, the Jewish population in France. Well, hang on. You can't just say, I'm only doing the military side. There's no logic to that. Even when you give them the story of Warsaw, where during the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, the German Army, the German Air Force, the Waffen-SS, the SS, the police, the railway workers, blah, 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 and go on forever, were all taking part in the destruction of the Poles. 354 railwaymen were killed. German railwaymen were killed, suppressing the resistance movement in Warsaw. Well, if that's not wholesale commitment to genocide and Holocaust, I don't know what is. And to be able to try and divorce that from the stories, I think is a mistake. And that's why I think Mike Reynolds' books fell short, desperately short. But to me, he was recovering a reputation which wasn't there in the first place. And that's the problem.
It's interesting because you just referenced your book's Birds of Prey there, which pretty much destroys that myth of the clean Luftwaffe. We know the Waffen-SS wasn't clean, even though there were attempts to separate the Waffen-SS from the SS that guarded concentration camps and that type of thing.
That was really funny. That was probably the funniest of all of them, because I used to laugh when they came up with that. I actually met a group of SS men in Saarbrücken, one of their little communities, and I sat with them, and they tried to actually tell that story, that it was the Allgemeine, the general SS, who were in the camps. Well, okay, where did the 3rd SS Panzer Division come from? The Totenkopfverbände, where did that come from if it hadn't come from the camps?
Yeah.
It's just nonsense.
It's mythologized.
And they used to build up these fantasies.
Yeah. It's completely mythologizing. Pretty much established now that no part of the Wehrmacht was clean. And come to the 1950s, you're getting things like the German government realizes now they have to try and rehabilitate the German forces. And they've been aided by the likes of Eisenhower, who sort of changes his tack, because he realised now the next threat is the Soviet Union. They need the Germans to rearm. So how much did what we've just discussed here, this mythologising, trying to separate the dirty from the clean, how much was also that playing into the need to rehabilitate the Germans as a nation and also their ability to raise an armed force again?
Well, it's interesting you should mention that, because in the 50s, Konrad Adenauer's constant statement was you can't throw out the baby with the bathwater. The fact of the matter is, if you're going to recreate some form of military force in Germany, not recreate, but to build a military force in Germany and rearm, you're going to have to use people with military experience. And as far as I recall, that was limited to colonels. So they actually wanted the NCOs because the German NCO was legendary. I mean, you know, here's a part of the German military forces which is something very important. They're NCOs, of which they had many, many different types, many different levels, were critical to the German army, not the officers. The men who did the real fighting, the men who decided whether a detachment was going to fight a battalion, was the sergeants. And it's interesting how those NCOs always figure in the reports, especially with the British intelligence officers who would say things like, the German NCO will fight, and when he decides to stop, they'll surrender. But if he decides to fight, everybody fights. And that has a certain kudos about the German forces. So In the 50s, you get, so as far as I understand it, lots of the NCOs, former NCOs, being taken into the new Bundeswehr. Of course, at the same time, you get the colonel level operatives, the fighter aces, the naval officers, the German army, and you get men like Heusinger coming in and setting up a new branch. And as they're building that force, they're recreating a story about the Wehrmacht. And what you perhaps are not aware of, but you may well be, I don't know. They produce a whole series of former German officers in the Second World War who become NATO officers, become authors to a series called Wehrmacht in Kampf. And the justification for writing the books is so that they can learn about future conflict. So you get senior intelligence officers who were just on the cusp of becoming generals, but not quite. They managed to get through the Second World War fairly unscathed. They get into a position where their chief they now become generals of intelligence, signals, what have you, and they get their buddies who were in fighting formations to write about a certain aspect of the war. So you get one I'm particularly aware of is Hermann Geyer. His study is used. He committed suicide at the end of the war. He was a general, but the man who endorsed him knew of the report he had written in 1941 of the German invasion of Russia. So they took that report, he gave it a foreword and he gave it a conclusion, and the report, which actually was written in 1941 for Hitler, went into the system. And I've used the book because it was fairly well detailed for the pure purposes of understanding the Ninth Corps operations in 1941 in the forest area before Birds of Prey, became the Luftwaffe. All of these books built up quite an impressive library of how the German army had operated, and they were all written from the perspective of, this is informing us for the future, these are going to be the training manuals. The problem was there, when you look at some of those books, is there were odd things going on that you can't very easily walk away from. So, for example, 1941, you have the Barbarossa Directive. The Barbarossa Directive is you will kill Jews, you will kill partisans, so on and so forth. And by the way, if you kill civilians, you German soldiers won't be guilty of murder anymore. So they pretty much removed the military controls over the jurisdiction of the German forces and gave the German soldier a license to kill. That was completely missing. It wasn't until much later that these facts started to come in, and there were tensions in German society. And, in the 1960s, you have things like the Treblinka trial and the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial taking place. And at the same time, the German army is trying to say, well, we're not part. The new Bundeswehr German army is trying to say, well, we were never part of that. And to a certain extent, a lot of people believed it. And that's why when you get to the world of war, as I mentioned before, people think of Galland and Speer and Manteuffel as honest, decent folk who were wrapped up in a criminal empire. They don't see their part in the criminal exercise. They don't see their criminality because they don't want to, and B, they're not given the opportunity to understand the criminality. So Galland is, I ran out of fighters, blah, 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 and it was all tough and all the rest of it. It's not until you get to the 1990s when he's interviewed by Gita Sereni. Now take this. He's in an aeroplane with Himmler, with Speer, and they look out the window and they fly over Auschwitz, and Himmler says there's only 20,000 left. And according to Galland, that was the moment in 1942 when he understood what the Nazi regime was about. That's what he told Gita Sereni. Gita Sereni at the time was only interested in isolating Speer as a war criminal because she felt there was more to come out, and she discovered it. The interesting story for me was Adolf Galland had told everybody since long before he died, throughout the whole of the 60s, 70s, 80s, that he knew nothing about the Holocaust. He's in a conversation with Albert Speer, and he admits to knowing about the Holocaust, but doesn't reflect on the fact that he's been telling everybody the same story, that he didn't know anything about it for 40 years.
But is that not reflective of German society as a whole, though? Because, you look at it post-war, you've got the trials and all the other bits and pieces. Then you get to the 60s, and kids born in the war are starting to ask their relatives, what did you do in the war? People denying they were ever part of the Nazi party or they had no part in it. And then you get through to sort of the mid-90s onwards, and you start to see a representation of German victimization literature coming out, you know, where they're taking into account the bombings, the German ethnic expulsions at the end of the war, the mass rapes by the Russians in Berlin, post-war internment, and they're trying to balance that empathy and condemnation. So I think as a nation that they have struggled with the truth in some respects.
And still do. I mean, it's very interesting. If you look at what actually happens with the Wehrmacht in the East, there's this assumption that the Russians are revenge raping all the way through in 1944-45 when they get into German territory. Question is, why would it be revenge raping? Well, it's revenge.
Revenge says it if it doesn't say it. Yeah.
The German army, once it got into the East, there was no controls. So it could do whatever it wanted. And rape was huge. I mean, the sex crimes of the Wehrmacht, written by a friend of mine, it's just a horrendous story.
I think a really good example of indoctrination of a nation. I saw it on YouTube only a couple of years ago, and I don't know if you've seen it. It's a clip of a comedian called Johnny Buchart at the 1973 Cologne Carnival. And he starts doing a call and refrain from the audience. He says something, they repeat it back. And then he leads it into a thing, he's going zigga, zigga, zigga. They go zigga, zigga. Then he goes Sieg. And as one, this hall goes, Hail! And he just, and he goes, wow, we've got a lot of the old comrades in here tonight. And I think, again, I'm in danger of going off in tangents here, but I think this whole thing about what we've been talking about with the army, it's running parallel with the nation, that denial, the fact that this comedian 25 years after the war can do something like that, and they're indoctrinated that much they can't help themselves from doing it.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I wrote this, what I call a reverse military history of Aachen. It's from the perspective of Aachen, but it's a reverse military history by looking at the people about to be invaded by the Americans and everything that goes on with it when they invaded Belgium in the First World War and the whole story. A lot of people said to me, well, why do you want to look at it from that perspective? And I said, because we need to turn the whole story on its head. We've got to the stage, even now, where we're still going on with this nostalgiaism, which is running through all the shelves of Waterstones, that you go through the same old story. We're not learning anything new. We're not re-examining the evidence we've got before us. And it just struck me, here was a moment to actually, on the 80th anniversary, to reverse everything upside down. And in that process, unfortunately, the British occupation of Aachen came out badly. The American siege of Aachen came out badly. But the Germans came out worse. That's the problem we have. The war is not being, how can I put it? The narrative of the war is still stuck into some form of nostalgia. And yes, it's easy for the Germans to say, well, it wasn't us because we were eggs. And to a certain extent, you can still see that. I mean, the magazines that are being produced at the moment, these anniversaries, the Seelover Horn and all of these things that are on the magazine shelves in Aachen. The other side of German military operations that were actually happening at that stage and what happened in Bagration when, during the middle of Bagration, 1.5 million Hungarians are transported to extermination camps and over 1 million of them dying in Auschwitz, or whatever it was in Auschwitz. That whole story gets completely lost. The Germans are saying, oh, look, Bagration, we're losing the German army, blah, blah, blah. Oh, hang on a minute. The German army is going through this process, but at the same time, it's happily ensuring that all of these Jews are taken out of Hungary, put into an extermination camp and murdered at the height of the and at the same time that's happening, they're losing their fight in Normandy, and at the same time they're destroying Warsaw. Now, how mad can that be?
So what are the dangers then today when we continue to...
do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I agree.
There isn't one point... No, I was just going to say, there isn't one point in the war when you can turn around and safely say, this is only military history.
But my question then is, what are the dangers then from this continued uncritical admiration of the German army, from their tactics and training to everything else in World War II. What are the dangers today if we continue not to look at this in a more critical manner that you've described?
It's easy to say if we don't learn from history, we're going to do the same mistakes, and I don't think that's going to happen. I certainly don't think that we will have a situation where Auschwitz will be recreated. I simply just don't think that's possible. I mean, it's conceivable that humanity will go down the toilet eventually, but I don't see it going that far. What I do see, though, when I watch things on social media and, in particular things like shows on YouTube and elsewhere, there's this subtle glorification of the German army or the German armed forces in the Second World War, with some marvelous tunes of German soldiers marching to whatever. And you think to yourself, why? What's being achieved here? Is it just to get followers? Is it just to get income? From where I am, from my perspective, which is to live in Germany, to understand perhaps a little bit more about the German situation, to have certain empathy with the German people from the bombing perspective. I've always said I think the bombing was unnecessary, and I still believe that. But at the same time, Germany should be sorrowful for the crimes that it committed. And it's not just against British soldiers and Jews and Sinti Romani, it's for everything else. All of those poor slave workers, 7, 8, 9 million of them. The problem is, what are they gaining from watching a program with a tiger tank firing its shells to the music of, I don't know, Lily Marlene? If it had been available in my youth, when I was interested in military history per se and doing war games and things, there might have been something there, but I never recall in all the time of my youth, when we did Airfix kits and read action comics and all the rest of it, having anything but horror for the Germans. Perhaps it's because one of my relatives had been in the liberation of Belsen, and very early on it was made clear to me just how evil these people were. I think as we've got more remote, something's happened, and I constantly refer, I don't know if you know or you're aware of Matthew Ford, a friend of mine who's written books on smartphones and the changing nature of the radicalization of war through social media. Our discussions have been that somehow with the digitalization of everyday life, all of the stuff that was done in the past has been now rewritten and retranscripted and turned into new content for a new audience that's eager to know or to see short snaps of German soldiers doing whatever they're doing, or tanks or aeroplanes, to a certain amount of music, but it doesn't last very long. The question is that being taken on board such that the future British Army soldiers are going to run around with a SS camouflage jacket under their tunic? Or is it that they're going to say, okay, when I'm in a battle situation, I'm going to do an outflanking movement like Unteroffizier König in Phil Blood's Birds of Prey book? Really? I'm not so sure. On a higher plane, Germany is about to spend an awful lot of money on new equipment, military equipment and infrastructure and what have you. Will they be considering an army which is like the old Prussian army or the old German army or the old Weimar army or the Nazi army or the Bundeswehr? I'm not so sure. I don't think there's anything positive to be gained from rejigging the history such that there's programs that start with Achtung, Achtung or whatever. I just don't see that that's achieving anything. I do think open discussion like we're having, talking about a range of things and saying, okay, there's different possibilities of looking at the same thing from different angles. So I can actually say the German infantry NCO was a good soldier. They were generally hard fighters. They were tough men to deal with. But at the same time, I can look at the whole system and say, look, they were fighting on behalf of something despicable. Whether that is being transmitted at the youth level, I don't know. I certainly know that German youths still hold what happened as a problem. They still feel uncomfortable about the history, the past. Okay, there's a strain that support, I don't know, AFD or whatever. But generally speaking, from the students that I taught, from the young people I meet still, to the associations I have in Germany, the past is still uncomfortable and they don't want to be reminded of what they did. They want to go forward in a different way. And I think that's safe. So I think for Britain to adopt military measures like the Nazis as a role model, I just think's crazy. Why? Why would you do? No one's ever been able to explain to me why we need to follow the losers.
I totally agree. I mean, using myself as an example, going back to the 1980s, where there was, and myself included, you sort of uncritically admired the performance of the Heer specifically, and the German soldier. Even in the 80s, how evil the Waffen SS was perfectly clear. But it took me another 10 years and reading more books and becoming better educated to become aware of that clean Wehrmacht myth. So I think once people educate themselves a bit more, putting aside the problem you've just mentioned there about social media and YouTube channels that are flashing up 10-second clips, because that's what people's attention span is. It's whether they can go out and critically look for other things and get the bigger picture about the performance of the German forces in the war. I think you're right. That is a real concern.
This 10-second slot is killing everything. It's killing reading, it's killing concentration, it's killing society in the end. I don't mean to be a grumpy old fart, but the fact of the matter is society is now so riven by the smartphone. I was watching, I like steam trains. I was watching a guy fueling a steam engine the other day, and he's turning on the water while on the mobile phone, and the water crane's pouring out water. But he's done it in such a way before the tube has gone into the tender of the steam engine. So all he's done is he's turned on the thing while he's on the phone and flushed his mate, nearly flushed his mate off the back of the tender. All this water going everywhere, and he hasn't even noticed because he's totally in his mobile phone. I mean, that just struck me as very funny and highly amusing. So there is that side. We are in this kind of world now. Whether with all of the stuff, all of the content that's flying out there, so you'd have a chieftain tank for 10 seconds, you have Colin Ferguson's artillery firing for 10 seconds, the whole mass of all of that just becomes lost to a mishmash of short images of violence and aggression, and it disappears. How much of that will imprint on someone's memory, I don't know. What I have noticed more and more, and I take this as a straw poll from going to war games conventions, the number of war bases, battlefields, war gamers recreating battles, there's fewer and fewer of Germans. It's very rare now. Most of the kids are into Warhammer, so they do this science fiction stuff. And there is a sense that, to a certain extent, military history is fading.
See, that surprises me when you walk into, bookshops and that. There's still huge military history sections. So is that existing for, I'll use your phrase there, Phil, old farts like us? who still sadly read quite a bit. And so are those big sections in bookshops catering for us then?
I think so. I talked to some school teachers and they're saying to me that after a certain age, kids are just not reading. I had a conversation with a university group at a conference in Lisbon, and my conversation was this: we're rapidly losing people to reading and concentration in the classrooms, in the seminars, and fewer students coming through who are struggling with, some of it's post-COVID and they got locked out, and some of it's this smartphones and being focused on that. I was being criticised by the seminar group, saying I was being unduly critical and being a little bit too low down on the future. Meanwhile, a professor who is now president of the Royal Historical Society in UK, she was doing a tweet saying, Phil Blood's right on the nose. We're all suffering this, and finally someone's had the courage to say something about it. That's what worries me. It worries me that when, after I said all of that conversation, a professor of German history turned to me and said, my history is in the 1840s. There was no smartphones then, so why is it my issue? And I
head the sand stuff
that
really
kind of, yeah. And I think suddenly everybody's waking up to the fact that we're living in a strange society. It's like I posted earlier this week about this program called Adolescence, where the kid was talking to his father, and father just didn't understand the emojis that were on the mobile phone. And I thought that just tells you everything, really, that the language is shifting and our understanding of things has shifted. I mean, in my day, my friends, we would have had a long conversation about the qualities of the Tiger tank or the fighting of the Großdeutschland division or the 7th Armored Division, whatever. And now today, I think what interests younger people is different. And I can't say what it is because I'm not that age group.
Yeah, I think if we were to talk about something that interests kids these days, a podcast would have lasted 5 minutes, Phil. But I've got one more question for you, and I started off with a Jerry quote, and I'm going to finish with one. So in 18 Platoon, then, Jerry writes about the Germans' performance in the war. It is, of course, very much their own interest to encourage the theory and myth that although superior as fighting men, they were beaten only by numerically superior forces and firepower. In my experience, this was not so. In many attacks, the prisoners we took outnumbered our attacking force, and German units who would continue to resist at close quarters were few indeed. Unlike us, they rarely fought at night, when they were excessively nervous and unsure of themselves. Where we patrolled extensively, they avoided it. I can remember only one successful German patrol and not one successful night action. If our positions had been reversed, I doubt if they would perform better than we did. Without doubt, some Wehrmacht formations were extremely professionally competent, but many were not. Some of the enemy infantry fought with fanaticism, but most did not. And I think you can see we've actually touched on quite a few of those little points out there, and you've brought out some of them as well. But a final question to you is, taking into account all we've discussed, why was the German army so difficult to defeat? Why did it take the combined logistics and mights of the Americans, the sheer human tidal wave of the Russians, and our dogged determination to fight as hard as we could?
I think people are learning this again because it was a lesson hard learned and rapidly forgotten after the Second World War. And that is that modern warfare is not easily predictable. You can't just say, I'm going to spend £1 billion on, as they did, on bombers, bomb all the German cities and Hitler's going to surrender. All that proved was the more you bomb, the more they're going to fight. With the Russians, the Russian learning curve, it's funny, the Russian learning curve, the British learning curve and the American learning curve were all pretty much consistent. After a period of losses, and the Americans had losses at Kasserine Pass, and obviously in Pearl Harbor, but fighting the Germans, they got a bloody nose at Kasserine Pass, and they got one or two others. The British assigned in France in 1940, the Russians, not until Stalingrad, although on the ground level, the Russians showed the Germans that they were going to be bitter enemies. I mean, the fact that the Russians, after the Germans had gone 200 miles away, were still fighting in that area, 200 miles back, still fighting strong and committing to offences was a shock for the Germans. But I think once the armies of the three nations decided how they were going to fight their war, which is what you get from after Stalingrad and after El Alamein and to a certain extent after Kasserine Pass, the armed forces of those countries start to take on the Germans, not just a little bit here, a little bit there, but actually just to go for them full on. And I think the Germans were very lucky because they'd taken all that territory and they had a lot to be able to fall back on. They had huge resources of slave laborers, and they didn't have to worry too much about natural resources, which had been a problem in the First World War when the German army was going almost into a scrap iron business. The Germans could soften the blow. So hard war's coming, but they were able to soften the blow. And they also had something that Germany called the internal means of communications. So they could rush the fire brigade from one side of the Eastern Front to the Western Front The Royal Air Force wasn't bombing the train so much, so the Germans had this free movement of troops from one side to another, so they could put resources into the right places. I've often said if the Allies had gone to Aachen first and then gone to Arnhem, they'd have pulled all the German reserves to Aachen, and then as they landed in Arnhem, they would have had a free range to come over the top, and Germany just couldn't have had the resources to smash that counteroffensive. So there were mistakes. But was it hard? I think the Germans fought hard, as you would expect. They defended, but they weren't saving anything. It was just a slow grind. And so you've got to say, well, did it take a long time after the 6th of June 44? Less than a year. Whereas the rapid victory of Germany in May, June 1940 led to what? There was no final victory. They just led to a permanent state of war till 45. The Brits land in France the Brits and Americans land in France in 1944, pretty much over within a year. Same on the Eastern Front. As soon as the Germans get smashed, Army Group Centers destroyed at Bagration, the Germans just collapse. And then it's really a question of when the Russians can build up the resources to go again, and then build up resources to go again. The Russians are hitting the Germans with such force and power and firepower. The losses are incredible. And if you compare German losses in the Second World War to the British, the Americans and the Russians, obviously the Russians come out worse because of what happened in the early parts of the war, and with the Germans having captured so many prisoners of war and literally murdered the Russian prisoners of war, 3.5 million of them. Whereas with the Brits and the Americans, you're looking at about 340,000 each in combat casualties in the second, from that part of the war when the Americans and British are in. So the scales, I mean, what are the Germans? Some say 11 million, some say 14 million. We don't really know, but it's a huge loss. And they fought hard, but in all that hard fighting, they were never winning, were they?
They're holding back in essence, weren't they?
They're holding the line, collapses, they hold the line, then it collapses, they hold the line, then it collapses. I mean, the only time that you actually see the Germans do anything which is really substantial is the Battle of the Ardennes. And once the Americans settle down and realize that they can fight these people one for one, and they're not all Tiger tanks, and what Tiger tanks are there are all breaking down, then the Americans start slapping them around and treating them with sheer amount of firepower and destruction. And then once the air power comes in, well, the Germans are running. The thing, though, that you said in that report, which was very interesting from Jarry, is they didn't do patrols and they didn't fight at night. Here's the interesting thing. The British Army did patrols. That's a distinguishing feature between the Brits and the Americans. If you look at the very famous incident when Bobby Brown gets his Medal of Honor over here in Aachen, in Verleitenheide, he does the patrols before the attack, he on his own. And having set the ground, when he goes out to fight, he finds two of his platoons of his company won't move, too frightened. Too tired, too frightened, won't move. So he pretty much does the fortifications on his own. He gets the Medal of Honor because he's wounded 4 or 5 times, destroys the fortifications single-handed using Bangalore torpedoes and all the good things they use, which then takes you back to something I mentioned before about Slam Marshall and how we analysed the Allied forces and soldiers and how they fought. Here's an example of what happened in the Aachen area where American soldiers just did not always patrol and fight. It's just one of those things. It happens at times when soldiers are really exhausted in hard war. The same thing happened with the Germans, perhaps slower because they had this tight nucleus of an NCO structure which held them together longer. But once those NCOs lost it, then the Germans started to break. And it's very interesting, the SS divisions never got enough NCOs. Always were short because that was one of their biggest problems at the end, being able to replace those men. With the German army, it was a huge problem. They were having to take them out of the reserves and support areas, and eventually you had no infrastructure to make the army operate in in an effective way, which is why you got the wrong dynamite and the wrong fire controls at the Remagen Bridge and other similar stupid things that happened, because you just did not have the infrastructure anymore. Yeah, they put everybody into the trigger. They were all what they call them, trigger pullers, but there was nobody at the back.
It's interesting you mentioned there about patrols and that American, because in 18 Platoon, Jerry is not a fan of patrols at night. It's funny because even today, British Army patrolling is still a big thing. But Jerry says that, in his opinion, from his experience in Normandy, he didn't think it achieved much. And invariably, it was volunteers that went out. And the thing he had was, I think if I remember rightly, was the guys that go out the night patrols were the guys that liked to do it. And they were usually the better guys in the platoon. And he was worried that they would get, because of the dangers of night patrol, and he was concerned that these guys who were the better guys would get wounded or killed. So I think that was one of the reasons he was a bit against patrolling, but it still remains an important ethos in the British Army to today.
Well, I think these are factors that are priceless to the British military tradition, which we as a nation should be fairly proud of, because I think it's the fact that Tommy, what does Tommy look like? He's got a tin hat dangling from one side of his head. His garters are a bit tatty. He's a small bloke, probably about 5'6". The gun's probably as big as he is, dragging along the ground. And he's marching two SS officers that look like they've come off the parade ground.
I've been searching for that photo. Have you got a copy of that photograph? Can you send me a copy of it? I've been searching for that for years, because that epitomises the British Tommy in World War II. I know exactly the one you're talking about. I just realised you're describing a photograph I've been looking for years.
That's Tommy.
Yeah.
He is the perfect soldier.
Yeah, honestly, mate, I can't believe it. As soon as you started describing that there, I knew the image you were describing.
That is the British soldier. And to a certain extent, those were my relatives. If you look at photographs of my relatives, they're pretty much that form. And, I still have, everyone says, the German army's got all these fancy uniforms and everything. I think the British uniform of the Second World War is just fantastic. The way it buttons up, it's practical, it's khaki, it keeps the men warm. It's not got false synthetics in it like the Luftwaffe have, so the uniforms are breaking and falling apart and becoming threadbare. The British soldier has everything he needs. It's not the best, it's not American quality, but it's better than the Germans, and he is in a far better condition than the German soldier. And that's to everybody's advantage, because what it means is, in the end, he doesn't get the losses. And what we should be asking is not why the Germans have stayed in the battle, it's why the British were able to break this so-called massive army, smash it, and not suffer the losses that the Germans suffered. Why was the British artillery so good? I mean, you listen to Johnny Briggs talking about the 4th Armoured and the training process and some of the things that he discovered and writing, how they were learning from their operations, the use of tanks in combat. They were going back, they were having learning school, saying, this is what we gained from this position, then putting it back into the operations. So the troops are going forward. They're learning as they're going forward. That to me is just excellent. Yeah. This is an organisation that's not getting the resources that the Royal Air Force or the Royal Navy is getting. It's not getting all the equipment it needs. It's got manpower problems. And yet they're taking those resources that they do have and are dealing with them in such a way that they're getting maximum effort from it. I mean, that to me is remarkable.
No, I totally agree.
And this fighting machine going forward is just...
I mean, as a former gunner, Phil, I remember reading years ago, and I forget, it was a German general, I can't remember which one, but he said that from his perspective of fighting the British, the most professional arm was the Royal Artillery, the gunners. I'll try and find the quote and dig it out at some point. But I think often describing what you're talking about there, the more glamorous arms of the British Army and the likes of the Royal Air Force and that get their due credit. But I think the sort of the workaday branches of the army, the logistics guys, the Royal Army Medical Corps, because we were well ahead of the German Army's medical sort of treatment of their soldiers was rudimentary compared to what the Allies could give. And I think sometimes this is argument about who was better. Those support services, the non-teeth arms, do get missed out quite a bit as well.
I mean, I was fortunate. I had an uncle who was in the Royal Artillery in the 8th Army, firing 5.5-inch medium guns. So I had him telling his story. As I mentioned before, my Uncle Jim was in the 7th Armoured Division, and then I had another uncle who started in the Border Regiment. Well, stayed with the Border Regiment all the time, but because he was a naughty boy, along with the rest of the regiment in Mersa Matruh, they got sent to Burma, and he was given the option, stay in prison or fight as a Chindit. He went to be a Chindit. And their stories of fighting the Germans, okay, Jim had... The interesting thing about Jim was he had respect for the German army in Africa. He had absolutely no respect for the German army in the Western Front. And that dated from one point when I think one of his comrades was giving water to a wounded SS man, and the SS man stabbed him in the stomach. There was no niceties anymore. They'd gone from being maybe they'd give each other water and do whatever they did and sing Lily Marlene in the desert because there was a shared extremism. And as you say, there was no civilians around in the battlefield. Once you get into Western Europe, it is brutal. There's a lot of bad things going on. I mean, if we knew half of what was reported in the German archives for the way soldiers behaved in France, I'm sure there was just as much bad stuff going on in France from the Allied side. And there is a report now flowing around since 2000 that, the American army committed 14,000 and more rapes in the Western areas. Well, so there is issues there. But if you get down to the finer points of this fighting, I think the British Army still comes out as excellent. And for us to have this conversation, which I know is really about the German army and the German forces and fighting, I think we have to remember all along that the British Army is this excellent force.
That's a great point to finish on. I've kept you for a long time, but fortunately for you, I'm getting to the end of all my butting in and questions I've got for you. But I'm just going to ask you, first of all, is where can listeners get a hold of your books? Where's the best place for that?
Which one are we talking about?
Generally, your latest release is a book on Aachen, and you've got Birds of Prey, you've got the Bandit Hunters. So generally, if people are interested in...
Yeah, Amazon seems to be the place where most people pick up the books. And in the UK, I'm told Foyle's had Hitler's Bandit Hunters and War Comes to Aachen. I'm not too sure about the other two because they tend to be online.
I picked up Bandit Hunters online for sure. But what I'll do is I'll put in links to the book so people can read the titles and see if they're of an interest. So I'll put up some links and then people can search on Amazon and other places like that. So Desert Island Dits now, my favourite part of the programme a lot of time before I get to the esoteric choices of my guests. So first of all, Phil, what's your book, film and luxury item choice?
Okay, so the book was fairly easy because I particularly like Gore Vidal. He was an American writer, died about 10 years or so ago. And I would go for the United States, the essays 1952 to 1992, published in 2003 paperback. I like that book because if I hadn't gone down the route that I've gone down, I would definitely have gone into American history. I was really into American history. And when I was having my interview with Richard Holmes, he very nearly persuaded me to go into American military history.
Well, thankfully didn't, because we wouldn't be having this conversation today. So film choice.
Well, they should have been interested in trains and the American Civil War.
I'm not sure I quite would have had the fascination for that film, sorry. But film choice?
I'd like to... Well, there's two films. There's The General, 1926, with Buster.
Oh, yeah. That's got trains in it.
It's got trains in it, but I just love Buster Keaton. I mean, there's one point when he's got the sleeper dangling, the metal sleeper things and what have you. And the other would have been Citizen Kane, because I'm really into Orson Welles. Although you had me for a while with this, I thought it was for music.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought, this is going to be easy. I'll just have Beethoven's Ninth. Dead easy, no problem. Love it all the time.
Well,
films is a bit hard.
Well, that's certainly the first time I've Beethoven mentioned on the pod, mate. So you're breaking ground there. And luxury item?
Okay. Well, it's either one or the other. Depends if you've got heavy lift. If it's the train set, it goes in a trunk. And if it's the War Games collection and the model soldiers, you need a herpes.
So if I had to make choose one or the other, what would you go for?
Soldiers. War
You've
Games.
got an airdrop booked. But knowing the RAF, they'll turn up late, mate. So my choice is your book, Phil, Bandit Hunters, the SS and the Nazi Occupation of Europe. We haven't really got a time to go into this. We might do another podcast on it in the future, but what I liked about it is the whole anti-partisan piece that the Germans did in mainland Europe was hugely interesting. And what I discovered in your book was this wasn't something just cooked up at the start of the war. It went back to the previous century. And it also gave me a better realisation of where Hitler's notorious commando order came in and how it fitted into that wider piece. So I think what I might do is, after I come off the Camino, Phil, is maybe have in a few months' time, have a little chat about that, because I found it fascinating, this whole thing. Like a lot of things that the Nazi war machine did during the war, the sheer amount of time and effort and administrative detail, even about nomenclature, I just found absolutely fascinating. So if you're up for that, we maybe get on sometime.
Thank you very much. I mean, that's very kind of you. It was actually based on my PhD thesis. I finished the PhD, and Richard Holmes and Chris Bellamy said, well, now you have to write the book. And I said, well, can't you just publish the... And he said, no.
Do the hard work.
No. That's the first part over. That was just the summary of what you need to do. Now you have to write the book. So
yeah, no, it's interesting. It really shows you that Nazi mindset wasn't just. It reminded me of the detail they went into executing the Holocaust all throughout the war, and even when they knew the end was nigh, they seemed to accelerate these things. I just found it utterly bizarre behaviour. Thanks, Mike, for coming on the podcast, and to you, the listener, if you continue supporting suggestions, please keep them coming, and our email, social media links are at the bottom of the show notes. You can find us all the usual suspects, including Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. If you download us from iTunes, like the podcast, it'd be great if you could leave us a review there, or anywhere you get the podcast from. Thanks again to Nick Beale for his continued help in offering technical support for his company ISAR, and we'll see you next time on The Unconventional Soldier.